moment, I'm going to ask unanimous consent to pass the bipartisan Families First Act to help the hundreds of thousands of vulnerable children and their parents stay together and make the biggest improvement in child welfare policy in decades and decades in America. Right now, federal policy says taxpayer money can be used to split families apart and uproot the family home. With Families First, our bipartisan bill, and terrific work has been done by so many members on both sides of the aisle. Senator Bennett was here, gave an eloquent address about how important this is. Chairman Hatch, Chairman Grassley, Chairman Brady. This has been a bipartisan effort for months, for a number of members, for close to 3 years. And with our reform, the Families First bill, families will finally see that they will get some assistance to stay together, and stay together when it's safe to do so. If a parent can get a leg up with some help if they faced a drug addiction or a mental health problem, everybody wins, Mr. President, because the family stays together. If a grandparent can step in, one of the things I'm proudest of, Mr. President, is I wrote the kinship care law as part of welfare reform when I was a new member of this body. So we know that there are hundreds of thousands of grandparents out there who could step in these situations, or an uncle, and they could get a little bit of help raising a youngster, again, keeping the family together. Sometimes foster care is life-saving. I think all of us have said that from the beginning. But it shouldn't be the only option. And that's what kids who've been in the foster care system came to the Senate this week to tell us. It's our job as policymakers to protect the most vulnerable. These kids don't have a powerful lobby. They don't have deep pockets. It just seems to me, as we wrap up this session and everyone here goes back to their families and their holidays, it's not in good conscience to turn our back on the foster kids and allow this important bipartisan legislation to wither and to die in the last days of the 114th Congress. So, in a moment, I will make this unanimous consent request. I ask, Mr. President, that our colleagues end this standing in the way of providing a new measure of hope for vulnerable kids and their families, and that we help lift the weight of this broken status quo that falls heaviest on the hundreds of thousands of foster kids living in a quiet struggle every single day. So, Mr. President, at this time, I would ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Calendar 527, H.R. 5456, that the Wyden substitute amendment at the desk be agreed to, the bill as amended be read a third time and passed, the motions to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from North Carolina.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I was wondering if I could direct a question through the chair to the senator from West Virginia. And I was curious as to whether or not the good senator, my friend and colleague, intends to object to this measure.
To this measure? No, sir.
Okay. Mr. President, I actually think that Senator Wyden's done some good work on this measure. I hope that we can get to a point where we can bridge the gap and address some concerns of some of the members in states that are concerned with unintended consequences. But at this time, and for reasons unrelated to this measure, But to our inability to get other unanimous consents through, I'm going to have to object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President,
Senator from Oregon.
I'll be very brief. And as I've indicated to our colleague from North Carolina, and he is new to the Senate, but he really brings a refreshing openness to these debates. And I know this was a new topic for him. He hasn't had a chance to hear a lot about it over the last few years, and he was concerned about what this would mean to group facilities, group homes in his state. And I said, look, if there's a problem in North Carolina in terms of trying to meet these measures, we've said we'll give states more time. We'll give them more flexibility. And I'd just like to point out that there seems to be enormous support across North Carolina with respect to this bill, because in North Carolina, they seem to be saying that they understand that what this legislation is all about, what Families First is all about, is just getting high-quality care for these youngsters. And all of the providers would be eligible. It doesn't speak to the type of provider, it's all the providers. So I'm just going to wrap up by a few quotes that came in to the Finance Committee over the course of this legislation. The North Carolina Association of County Directors of Social Services, which, as I understand it, is the association of entities that administer child welfare programs in the state of North Carolina, support the legislation. We've got a letter that reads, "We go on record as supporting the act and respectfully request your support in passing this important legislation," unquote. The North Carolina Association of Social Workers supports the bill. They wrote, and I quote, "The legislation would strengthen families so that more children could remain safely with their parents and family caregivers and avoid the need for foster care for the overwhelming majority of children." Mr. President, this North Carolina group says this legislation could be a lifesaver. The North Carolina Pediatric Society writes that the bill is a pivotal opportunity for a major federal policy shift away from placing children in out-of-home care and toward keeping families together. Congregate care remains one of the options on the continuum, and the bill doesn't impose time limits or restrictions on the use of these settings for children who need them, but the focus is on keeping families together. The only changes this bill makes for congregate care providers is raising the standards for quality so that all children in these settings benefit from the therapeutic value of the best providers, of which we have several in North Carolina. So the Children's Home Society of North Carolina, Children's Hope Alliance, the Exchange Family Center, Family Preservation Community Services, First North Carolina, a number of groups, all based serving North Carolina citizens, have come out for this. So I recognize that there has been an objection. It's my intention, Mr. President, to keep working through the night, through the early part of tomorrow. I appreciate that this senator from North Carolina has kept an open mind on this. He's indicated in our conversations that he understands that there's a lot of good in this bill, and for the reasons that he stated, he can't support it tonight, and I gather reasons unrelated to the bill. And I look forward to working with him. He has come to the Senate fairly recently, but I have found him open and accessible, and that's all you can ask of a colleague. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.